Get her off this aircraft right now. Melissa Grant's voice cracked through the first-class cabin like a blade dragged across glass, sharp enough to silence every conversation within seconds. Heads turned instantly. A man in a navy suit froze halfway through sipping sparkling water. A little girl near row 3 stopped swinging her legs. Even the soft jazz humming through the cabin speakers suddenly felt distant beneath the tension spreading through Aurora Atlantic Flight 908 parked at gate C-17 inside Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Naomi Carter didn't move. She remained seated in seat 1A with one hand resting calmly on the armrest and the other holding her phone loosely across her lap. Black hoodie, dark jeans, white sneakers. No jewelry except for a silver watch tucked beneath her sleeve. Nothing about her appearance matched what Melissa thought first class should look like. And that was exactly the point. "Ma'am, I'm speaking to you." Melissa snapped again, stepping closer into the aisle. "You need to gather your things and leave this plane immediately." Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward her. Calm, steady, unbothered. The kind of calm that made angry people even angrier. Around them, passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some pretended not to watch while watching everything. Others openly stared now that the confrontation had become impossible to ignore. Naomi's black carry-on sat neatly in the overhead compartment above seat 1A, but one of the junior flight attendants had already removed it and placed it near the galley like discarded property. "This is my assigned seat," Naomi said quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the cabin anyway. Melissa folded her arms. Blonde hair pulled tight into a perfect bun. Crimson lipstick. Corporate smile gone cold. "That seat belongs to an executive priority passenger," she replied. "Not someone trying to sneak into first class." A few rows back, someone whispered, "Oh no." Another passenger slowly raised a phone beneath chest level and pressed record. Naomi glanced toward the boarding bridge where passengers were still entering the aircraft in slow clusters. The line had stalled. Now, everyone sensed something ugly unfolding. Captain Daniel Brooks appeared from the cockpit moments later, tall and broad-shouldered, carrying the kind of authority that depended entirely on being unquestioned. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked, though his tone suggested he had already chosen a side. Melissa pointed directly at Naomi without hesitation. "She's refusing to leave first class after being asked multiple times." Naomi looked up at him. "I boarded with a valid boarding pass." Daniel barely acknowledged her words. Instead, his eyes drifted across her hoodie, her sneakers, her plain black backpack resting near her feet. Judgment happened in seconds. Maybe less. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "I'm going to need you to cooperate before this escalates." Naomi leaned back slowly in her seat. Escalates into what? That question lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Melissa stepped forward again, voice louder now for the audience gathering around them. "People try this all the time. Fake upgrades. Stolen boarding groups. They assume we won't notice." A white businessman across the aisle chuckled under his breath. "Crazy world nowadays," he muttered. Naomi heard him. So did everyone else. But she still didn't react. The cabin wasn't loud anymore. It was watching. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe." These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi Carter. Naomi had boarded the aircraft 12 minutes earlier without saying more than 3 words to anyone. No assistant. No designer luggage. No security detail. Just another passenger, at least on the surface. But hidden beneath the quiet simplicity was a reason for every detail. For months, anonymous complaints had flooded Aurora Atlantic's internal ethics division. Black travelers reporting humiliations. Quiet removals from premium seating. Random ID checks that somehow always targeted the same people. Naomi had read every report herself late at night from her Manhattan office overlooking the Hudson River. She'd memorized the language employees used. Didn't match the customer profile. Passenger appeared suspicious. Potential seating discrepancy. Corporate wording for something uglier underneath. So she dressed down intentionally. Flew alone intentionally. Tested the airline intentionally. And now, sitting in seat 1A while half the cabin watched her like a criminal, Naomi realized the complaints hadn't exaggerated anything. They had understated it. Melissa suddenly reached toward Naomi's armrest. I need your boarding pass again. Naomi didn't hand it over immediately. You already scanned it at the gate. Melissa's jaw tightened. And now I'm asking again. Behind her, a young trainee flight attendant named Alyssa Moore stood frozen near the galley entrance holding a tablet against her chest. Nervous eyes. Quiet posture. She looked between Naomi and the captain like she wanted to say something, but wasn't sure if courage would cost her job. Then Melissa turned sharply toward her. Alyssa, she barked, call ground security. Now. The cabin temperature seemed to drop all at once. The silence after Melissa ordered security felt heavier than turbulence. Nobody in the first-class cabin looked comfortable anymore. Passengers shifted in their seats pretending to check emails or scroll through their phones, but every pair of eyes kept drifting back toward seat 1A where Naomi Carter still sat perfectly still beneath the soft amber cabin lights. Alyssa Moore hesitated near the galley with her fingers wrapped tightly around the cabin phone. She was only 24 years old, 6 months into training, and already learning how quickly fear could spread through a crew when authority decided someone did not belong. Melissa noticed her hesitation immediately. Alyssa, she snapped again. Did you hear me? Alyssa swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am. But she still did not move. Captain Daniel Brooks crossed his arms and stared down at Naomi with controlled irritation. This flight is already delayed 6 minutes, he said. We are not going to hold departure over this situation. Naomi looked toward the cockpit door behind him. Interesting choice of words, she replied softly. Daniel frowned. Excuse me. Naomi tilted her head slightly. You call me a situation. Melissa laughed under her breath. Well, you certainly are not helping yourself. The businessman across the aisle smirked again. If she had the right seat, this would already be over. Naomi glanced toward him calmly. You assumed the problem started with the seat. That answer landed harder than he expected. His smile faded instantly. The air inside the cabin no longer felt premium or polished. It felt charged. Like everyone understood they were witnessing something they would later describe to other people in uncomfortable detail. A teenage boy sitting 2 rows behind first class leaned toward his mother and whispered, Why are they acting like she did something wrong? His mother lowered her voice carefully. Because some people decide things before they know facts. Melissa heard them anyway. Her face tightened further. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced loudly to the cabin, we apologize for the inconvenience. We are currently dealing with a passenger verification issue. Naomi slowly looked up at her. Verification issue? Melissa ignored the question and turned back toward Alyssa. Call security now. Alyssa finally lifted the phone but paused again as her eyes drifted toward the tablet tucked against her chest. The executive flight manifest remained open on the screen. She had seen the name herself earlier during boarding preparation. Naomi Carter. Executive clearance. Priority authorization level black. The highest level in the system. Alyssa's heartbeat quickened. Captain, she said carefully. I think there may be a misunderstanding. Melissa spun around so fast her scarf shifted loose from her collar. There is no misunderstanding. Alyssa took a nervous breath. Her name appears on the executive manifest. For 1 second the cabin froze completely. Even Daniel seemed caught off guard. But Melissa recovered instantly. Anyone can manipulate a digital manifest, she said sharply. That does not mean anything. Naomi watched her quietly. The calm in her expression somehow made Melissa look even more frantic. Daniel stepped closer toward Naomi's seat. Ma'am, I need you to cooperate before airport. Police become involved. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly for the first time. Not anger. Recognition. She had heard that tone before. Years earlier at 21 years old when a gate agent in Dallas accused her of using a stolen boarding pass because she was flying business class in sweatpants after a delayed connecting flight. She remembered standing alone at the counter while white passengers walked around her like she was contagious. She remembered the humiliation more than the words. The way people stared without speaking. The way nobody questioned authority, even when authority looked ugly. Back then she had cried in an airport bathroom for almost 20 minutes before boarding another flight 3 hours later. Now, 2 decades and billions of dollars later, she felt none of that fear. Only clarity. Naomi slowly crossed one leg over the other. Interesting, she said softly. The complaints were accurate after all. Melissa blinked. What complaints? Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked out the oval window beside her seat where rain streaked across the runway lights in silver lines. Atlanta thunderstorms had started rolling across the tarmac 10 minutes earlier, trapping planes beneath a sky that looked bruised dark blue. Then Naomi reached into her pocket and unlocked her phone. Melissa noticed instantly. "Who are you texting?" Naomi ignored her. Her thumb pressed one number from favorites. The call connected almost immediately. "Claire," Naomi said calmly. "Begin executive review protocol." On the other end, Claire Bennett's voice remained cool and professional. "Understood. Full crew." Naomi looked directly at Melissa while answering. "Every single person involved." Alyssa's eyes widened. Daniel's jaw tightened. Melissa folded her arms again, but the confidence in her posture cracked for the first time. "You think making phone calls changes anything?" she asked coldly. Naomi slipped the phone back into her lap. "No," she replied. "Truth usually does that on its own." The moment Naomi ended the call, something invisible shifted inside the aircraft. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but people felt it anyway. Melissa certainly did. Her posture remained rigid near the aisle, but the certainty that had fueled her voice minutes earlier no longer looked natural. It looked forced, like someone trying to keep control of a room already slipping away. Rain continued tapping softly against the aircraft windows while lightning flickered far beyond the runway. The storm outside mirrored the tension building inside the cabin. Nobody wanted to look away now. The businessman across from Naomi lowered his phone completely. Even he understood the atmosphere had changed. Captain Daniel Brooks glanced toward the cockpit, then back toward Naomi. "Executive review protocol," he repeated carefully. Naomi adjusted the sleeve of her hoodie and looked at him without blinking. "You heard me." Melissa scoffed immediately. "This is ridiculous." But her voice cracked slightly at the end. Small, almost invisible. The kind of crack only nervous people recognize because they hear it in themselves. Alyssa remained frozen beside the galley, clutching the tablet tighter against her chest. She had worked enough flights already to understand how hierarchy functioned inside airlines. Captains protected senior crew. Senior crew protected company reputation. Junior employees learned to stay quiet. But something about Naomi's stillness kept pulling at her instincts. Most passengers accused unfairly became emotional, defensive, loud. Naomi had become calmer with every insult. That frightened Alyssa more than anger would have. A notification suddenly chimed from Melissa's company tablet clipped beside her seat. She glanced down quickly. Her expression changed for half a second before she locked it away again. Naomi noticed. "So did Daniel." "What was that?" he asked. "Nothing important," Melissa replied too quickly. Another notification sounded, this time from Daniel's tablet inside the cockpit doorway. Then another from the galley terminal. One by one, small electronic tones echoed quietly through the cabin like warning bells. Passengers exchanged confused looks. Naomi leaned back slightly deeper into seat 1A. "Looks like corporate is awake now." Melissa folded her arms tighter. "You think pretending to know executives scares me?" Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Pretending?" Before Melissa could answer, a new voice entered the tension from the boarding bridge. "Captain Brooks." A gate supervisor stepped cautiously into the aircraft entrance holding a headset against one ear. His expression looked strained. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Daniel walked halfway toward him, clearly irritated at the interruption. "We are handling a passenger issue." The supervisor lowered his voice, though not enough to stop nearby passengers from hearing fragments. "Corporate operations is requesting immediate confirmation on executive passenger boarding status." Daniel frowned. "Executive passenger?" The supervisor glanced past him toward Naomi, sitting quietly in first class. "Yes, sir." Melissa stepped forward before Daniel could respond. This woman manipulated the manifest system somehow. Naomi almost smiled at that. Almost. The supervisor blinked in confusion. Manipulated. Alyssa finally found enough courage to speak again. Her name was already on the executive manifest before boarding. Melissa turned sharply toward her. "Stay out of this." The harshness in her tone made several passengers visibly uncomfortable now. A woman near row 4 whispered, "This is getting ugly." Another passenger muttered, "They should have checked facts before humiliating her." Those whispers started spreading across the cabin like wind through dry grass. Quiet at first, then impossible to stop. Melissa sensed it happening. Authority was slipping away from her inch by inch. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced stiffly, "we appreciate your patience during this delay." Nobody responded. Because the cabin no longer trusted her voice. Naomi looked toward the gate supervisor. You should probably answer corporate honestly. Daniel's jaw tightened. Enough. Naomi's eyes met his. You still think this is about a seat? Another notification sounded. This time Daniel pulled his phone from his jacket pocket immediately. His face darkened as he read the screen. Melissa tried to see over his shoulder. What is it? He did not answer right away. Naomi watched both of them carefully. Silent. Precise. The same way someone watches dominoes begin falling before anyone else notices the chain reaction has already started. Finally, Daniel looked up from the phone. Operations says departure is frozen until executive clearance is confirmed. Melissa stared at him. What executive clearance? Naomi slowly uncrossed her legs and stood for the first time since the confrontation began. The movement alone changed the energy inside the cabin. Passengers straightened in their seats instinctively. Naomi was not tall, but presence had nothing to do with height. Calm authority rolled off her now, so clearly it almost made the earlier accusations look absurd in hindsight. She looked directly at Melissa. You spent 20 minutes trying to remove me from this aircraft, she said quietly. Did it ever occur to you to ask why the plane was being held for one passenger? Melissa opened her mouth, but no words came out. And for the first time since boarding began, fear appeared plainly across her face. Melissa Grant had spent 15 years believing confidence could overpower truth if spoken loudly enough. But standing in the aisle of first class with 30 pairs of eyes fixed on her, she suddenly realized confidence had limits. Fear did not. The cabin remained unnaturally quiet except for the low hum of the aircraft ventilation and the distant roll of thunder outside the terminal windows. Naomi Carter stood beside seat 1A with one hand resting lightly against the leather headrest, calm as ever, while the people who had questioned her now looked increasingly uncertain about their own decisions. Captain Daniel Brooks stared down at the notification on his phone again, as if rereading it might somehow change the words. It did not. Executive Operations Override activated. Mandatory hold. Awaiting Chief Executive Authorization. His throat tightened slightly. Melissa stepped closer to him and lowered her voice. This cannot be real. Naomi answered before he could. Reality usually arrives before accountability. The sentence landed heavily across the cabin. A woman near row 2 slowly lowered her sunglasses and whispered, "Oh my God." The businessman who had mocked Naomi earlier suddenly became deeply interested in the magazine sitting unopened in his lap. Nobody wanted eye contact anymore. Alyssa Moore stood near the galley entrance trying to steady her breathing. She watched Naomi carefully now, replaying every moment since boarding began. The calm posture, the lack of panic, the way Naomi never once tried proving herself desperately the way innocent people often do when trapped inside unfair accusations. It finally made sense. Naomi had never been trying to gain authority in the room. She already had it. Melissa turned toward Alyssa sharply. Do not just stand there. Say something. Alyssa hesitated only a moment this time. I already did. Melissa blinked. Excuse me. Alyssa swallowed hard but held her ground. I told everyone her name was on the executive manifest. The words hit differently now. Stronger. Several passengers exchanged looks of disbelief. A middle-aged black man seated near the bulkhead shook his head slowly. You all heard her the first time, he said quietly. You just chose not to believe her. Melissa's face flushed red. Nobody asked for commentary from passengers. Maybe somebody should have, the man replied. Another voice joined in from farther back. She never raised her voice once. A woman near the aisle added softly. And all of you kept escalating it. The cabin was shifting. Naomi could feel it happening in real time. The witnesses were waking up one by one. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough truth entering the room to crack the illusion authority had built around itself. Daniel finally stepped toward Naomi with a completely different tone than before. Less command, more caution. Miss Carter, he began carefully. If there has been some misunderstanding, Naomi stopped him immediately. Do not call this a misunderstanding. Her voice stayed level, but something sharper lived underneath it now. A misunderstanding is getting a gate number wrong. This was a decision. Silence again. The kind that forces people to sit inside their own behavior without escape. Melissa folded her arms tighter. You still have not proven who you are. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. That is the problem right there. Melissa frowned. Naomi stepped slowly into the aisle. You decided I needed to prove myself the second you saw me. The rain outside intensified against the windows. Bright flashes of lightning reflected briefly across the polished surfaces inside first class, illuminating expressions people were trying hard to hide. Shame, regret, realization. Naomi continued calmly. Not because of my boarding pass. Not because of my seat assignment. Because I did not look like the version of power you were comfortable with. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody could. Even Melissa seemed unable to speak now. The truth had entered the cabin too clearly to push back out again. Alyssa lowered her eyes for a second, remembering something from training orientation months earlier. A quote displayed on a giant screen inside Aurora Atlantic headquarters during onboarding. Luxury begins with dignity. At the time it had sounded like another polished corporate slogan. But standing there now watching Naomi Carter face humiliation without losing composure, Alyssa finally understood what the words were supposed to mean. A new notification suddenly echoed from every crew tablet at once, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Melissa grabbed hers instantly. Her face drained of color before she even finished reading the message. Daniel's expression darkened moments later reading the same alert. Naomi already knew what it said before either of them looked up. Executive Compliance Team arriving at Gate C-17. Immediate personnel review in progress. Melissa looked at Naomi with disbelief spreading slowly across her face like ice cracking beneath pressure. Who are you? Naomi met her stare without hesitation. The person you tried removing from her own aircraft. For several long seconds, nobody inside the aircraft moved. The sentence Naomi delivered settled across the cabin with the weight of something irreversible. The person you tried removing from her own aircraft. Melissa Grant stared at her as though the words themselves refused to fit inside reality. Captain Daniel Brooks looked toward the boarding bridge again, searching for control that no longer existed anywhere around him. Outside the windows, airport lights blurred beneath sheets of rain, while ground crews hurried across the wet tarmac in reflective jackets glowing beneath lightning flashes. But inside first class, time felt trapped. Slow, heavy, unforgiving. Naomi remained standing in the aisle beside seat 1A, composed in a way that made everybody else appear smaller around her. No raised voice, no threats, just truth unfolding piece by piece until the room could no longer hide from it. Melissa tried one final time to reclaim authority. If you were really who you claim to be, she said carefully, you would have identified yourself immediately. Naomi looked directly at her. Why? Melissa blinked. Naomi stepped closer by only half a pace, but the movement shifted the entire energy around them. So you could suddenly decide to treat me with dignity after realizing I had power? The question hit harder than anger ever could. Nobody answered, because everyone already knew the answer. Naomi's eyes drifted slowly across the cabin. That is the problem with discrimination, she continued quietly. It disappears the second accountability enters the room. But the damage already happened. Alyssa lowered her gaze. The businessman across the aisle looked deeply uncomfortable now. Even passengers who had stayed silent throughout the confrontation seemed unable to escape the shame settling into the atmosphere. Then Naomi's expression changed slightly. Not anger. Memory. She looked out the rain-streaked window beside seat 1A, and for a moment Atlanta disappeared completely. She was 16 years old again, standing inside a luxury hotel lobby in Charlotte wearing her church dress after a statewide debate competition. She remembered the marble floors, the chandeliers, the security guard who stopped her before she reached the elevator because he assumed she was not a guest. She remembered trying to explain while people stared around her pretending not to notice. The humiliation had burned into her memory deeper than the actual words spoken that night. Years later, at a private investor conference in Los Angeles, another executive once handed her an empty coffee cup assuming she worked catering. At 31, she had been asked if she was lost while entering a boardroom she owned. Different cities, different people, same look in their eyes every time. Naomi returned to the present slowly. The cabin lights reflected softly against the silver watch hidden beneath her sleeve. I built this airline because I was tired of watching people get reduced before they even spoke, she said calmly. And tonight you proved exactly why this review became necessary. Melissa's confidence had fully collapsed now. I was following procedure. Naomi answered instantly. No, you were following assumptions. The sharpness in that response cut through the room cleanly. Daniel finally stepped forward again, but this time there was no command left in his posture. Only damage control. Miss Carter, perhaps we should continue this conversation privately. Naomi looked at him almost sympathetically. Interesting. You were comfortable making it public when you thought I was powerless. A few passengers nodded quietly. Someone near row 3 whispered, "Exactly." The cabin had completely turned now. Not because Naomi demanded support. Because people had witnessed enough to recognize injustice without needing it explained anymore. Then footsteps sounded from the boarding bridge. 3 figures appeared at the aircraft entrance wearing dark executive compliance jackets with Aurora Atlantic insignias stitched across their chests. The lead representative, a gray-haired woman carrying a tablet folder against her side, stopped immediately when she saw Naomi standing in the aisle. "Miss Carter," she said respectfully. "We came as soon as we received the alert." The entire cabin froze again. Not one passenger looked away. Melissa's face drained pale. Daniel straightened instinctively. Alyssa pressed a hand lightly against her chest, trying to steady her breathing. The executive representative turned toward the crew slowly. "Who initiated removal procedures against Chief Executive Officer Naomi Carter?" Nobody spoke. The silence became its own confession. Naomi folded her hands calmly in front of her. "That silence," she said quietly, "is always the loudest part." Melissa finally attempted to speak. "There was confusion regarding identity verification." The executive representative looked down at her tablet immediately. "Interesting," she replied coldly. "Because executive authorization confirmed her identity 19 minutes before boarding." The cabin erupted into stunned whispers. Melissa looked like the floor beneath her had disappeared. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. And Naomi Carter simply stood there in complete silence while the truth finished dismantling everything around them. The whispers spreading through the cabin no longer sounded confused. They sounded stunned. Passengers leaned into the aisle trying to hear every word, while the executive compliance team stepped fully on board beneath the flashing glow of rain outside the aircraft windows. The lead representative extended professional courtesy toward Naomi immediately. "Miss Carter, we are prepared to proceed with formal review procedures." Naomi nodded once. Calm, controlled, untouchable. Melissa Grant looked trapped inside a reality she could no longer argue with. Her shoulders remained stiff, but the certainty that had carried her through the confrontation was completely gone now. Captain Daniel Brooks stood beside the cockpit entrance, gripping his phone tightly, as new notifications continued appearing faster than he could read them. Crew access audit initiated. Executive incident review active. Personnel authority temporarily suspended pending investigation. Every alert pushed the atmosphere further toward collapse. Naomi glanced slowly across the faces around her. "Interesting how quickly respect arrives once a title enters the room," she said quietly. Nobody answered because nobody could deny it. The middle-aged passenger near the bulkhead shook his head again. "She told all of you without telling you," he muttered softly. Alyssa Moore stood silently beside the galley, but inside her chest something had shifted permanently. She had entered the airline believing professionalism automatically meant fairness. Tonight shattered that illusion in less than 30 minutes. She looked toward Naomi with something deeper than admiration now. Recognition. Naomi had not survived this moment because she owned power. She survived because she understood exactly what it felt like to have none. The executive representative opened her tablet folder carefully. "For transparency," she announced to the cabin, "this aircraft was delayed specifically pending arrival of Aurora Atlantic ownership review personnel." Several passengers gasped quietly. Melissa's eyes widened. Ownership review. Naomi finally turned directly toward her again. 3 weeks ago, a black surgeon was removed from first class on one of our Boston routes after a crew member assumed his ticket was fraudulent. Melissa stared without speaking. Naomi continued calmly. 6 months before that, an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary filed a complaint after being repeatedly questioned about whether they belonged in executive boarding. Daniel lowered his eyes. He already knew where this was going. Naomi stepped slowly down the aisle, every movement measured. And every report described the same thing. Same tone, same assumptions, same language. Her eyes settled directly onto Melissa, passengers who looked out of place according to someone else's imagination. The cabin felt smaller now, heavier. Every sentence stripped away another layer of defense. Melissa finally found enough breath to answer. I never treated anyone differently because of race. Naomi's expression did not change. Most discrimination hides behind professionalism. Silence again, sharp and immediate. Naomi continued walking slowly until she stood near the center of first class, where every passenger could see her clearly. Nobody ever says the quiet part out loud anymore, she said. Now it hides behind words like suspicious, verification, procedure, standards. Her voice remained low, but each word carried across the cabin with surgical precision. The language changes. The humiliation does not. A woman near row 4 quietly wiped tears from her eyes. The businessman across from seat 1A looked down at the floor, completely unable to meet Naomi's gaze anymore. Alyssa suddenly remembered how Melissa had ripped Naomi's boarding pass earlier with absolute certainty she belonged nowhere near first class. That certainty looked horrifying now in hindsight. The executive representative's tablet chimed again. She glanced down briefly before looking toward Daniel. Captain Brooks, she said professionally, corporate operations has temporarily suspended your command authority pending investigation. Daniel's face lost color instantly. Suspended. Effective immediately. The words landed like concrete. A stunned silence swept across the aircraft again. Daniel looked toward Naomi instinctively, as if searching for mercy there. But Naomi's face remained unreadable. Not cruel. Not satisfied. Just resolved. Melissa took a slow step backward into the galley area. This is insane, she whispered. Naomi heard her anyway. No, Naomi replied quietly. What was insane was believing you could publicly humiliate someone based on appearance and call it policy. Another notification echoed across the crew tablets simultaneously. Melissa grabbed hers with shaking fingers. Her crew credentials had disappeared from the active flight roster completely. Access status revoked pending executive compliance review. The words reflected faintly in her widening eyes. Passengers nearby saw it too. One man leaned back in disbelief and whispered, "This is happening live." Naomi looked around the cabin one final time before speaking again. People always ask why successful black professionals stay guarded in spaces like this, she said softly. Tonight you watched the answer happen in real time. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even the storm outside seemed quieter now beneath the weight of what had unfolded inside Flight 908. Then Naomi turned calmly toward the executive representative. Please escort the crew off my aircraft. The words "please escort the crew off my aircraft" hung inside the cabin like a final verdict. Nobody questioned them. Nobody even pretended to. The power dynamic that had controlled the last half hour collapsed completely in a matter of seconds. Melissa Grant stood motionless near the galley with her tablet hanging uselessly at her side, while Captain Daniel Brooks looked toward the cockpit he no longer had authority to enter. The executive compliance team moved calmly but efficiently through the aircraft aisle, their professionalism making the situation feel even more devastating for the crew involved. Naomi Carter remained composed beside seat 1A, as if the storm tearing through everyone else had somehow missed her entirely. The lead representative turned toward Daniel first. Captain Brooks, corporate transportation has been arranged for you pending review. Daniel swallowed visibly. Miss Carter, he began quietly, I want to apologize for how this situation was handled. Naomi looked at him steadily. You are apologizing because now you know who I am. Daniel had no response to that. Because once again, she was right. Melissa suddenly stepped forward, desperation beginning to replace arrogance. I made a judgment call under pressure. Naomi turned toward her slowly. No, she replied calmly. You made a personal assumption and wrapped it in company language. The cabin remained completely silent except for distant rain striking the aircraft windows. Passengers were no longer simply watching drama unfold. They were watching accountability happen in real time, and many of them looked unsettled by how familiar the situation felt once exposed clearly. Alyssa Moore stood near the front galley trying to absorb everything happening around her. She noticed something important then. Naomi never smiled during any of it. There was no victory in her expression, no satisfaction, only exhaustion hidden beneath control. Like this moment represented something older and heavier than one humiliating encounter on one delayed flight in Atlanta. Melissa looked toward the passengers surrounding them, as if hoping someone might still support her version of events. Nobody did. Not the businessman who mocked Naomi earlier. Not the couple sitting near row 2. Not even the passengers who originally stayed silent. The truth had become too visible now. "You embarrassed me in front of an entire cabin," Melissa whispered. Naomi's eyes sharpened slightly. "And what exactly do you think you did to me?" That question landed with brutal precision. Melissa's face fell completely. The executive representative stepped toward the galley and quietly instructed another compliance officer to secure all active crew devices for review. One by one, crew tablets disconnected from the aircraft system. The soft digital tones echoed through the cabin like doors locking shut. Daniel looked down at his phone again before slowly placing it into the compliance officer's hand. His shoulders sagged afterward. Years of command authority stripped away in less than 10 minutes. Naomi watched without celebration. "People think discrimination always looks dramatic," she said softly to the cabin. "Most of the time it looks ordinary. Calm voices, polite smiles, professional wording. That is why it survives so easily." Several passengers lowered their eyes hearing that. A woman near the aisle nodded slowly, as though remembering something painful from her own life. The businessman across from Naomi finally spoke up quietly. "I should not have said what I said earlier." Naomi looked toward him. "No," she replied gently. "But maybe now you will notice when others say it too." He nodded once, visibly ashamed. Alyssa suddenly stepped forward before fear could stop her again. "Miss Carter," she said carefully, "I am sorry nobody listened sooner." Naomi studied her for a moment. Unlike everyone else, Alyssa had tried to speak before power entered the room. That mattered. "Thank you for trying," Naomi answered quietly. Alyssa's eyes watered instantly, because sometimes being seen mattered more than being praised. Another flash of lightning illuminated the cabin while thunder rolled low outside the terminal. The storm had not passed yet, but the atmosphere inside Flight 908 had changed completely. Passengers no longer looked trapped in tension. They looked reflective, uncomfortable in honest ways. The executive representative approached Naomi once more. "Replacement crew is already en route," she informed her. "Departure can resume shortly if you approve." Naomi glanced slowly through the cabin. Every face looked back differently now than 30 minutes earlier. Not because her clothes changed, not because her voice changed, only because they finally understood who had been sitting among them the entire time. Naomi nodded once. Approved. Then she looked toward Melissa and Daniel one final time before they exited the aircraft. "The saddest part about tonight," she said quietly, "is that you would have treated me with perfect respect if I looked like someone you expected power to belong to." Nobody argued with her, because there was nothing left to argue against. The cabin doors remained open for another 12 minutes, while replacement crew members hurried through the terminal under sheets of cold Atlanta rain. Nobody complained about the delay anymore. Not after what they had witnessed. The atmosphere inside Flight 908 felt completely transformed now, quieter but heavier in a different way. The tension was gone. Reflection had taken its place. Passengers sat differently, spoke differently, looked at Naomi Carter differently. The same woman they had watched get questioned, doubted, and humiliated less than an hour earlier now stood near the front of the cabin calmly reviewing compliance reports with Aurora Atlantic executives, while ground operations waited for her approval before moving the aircraft even a single inch. The irony settled over everyone like a weight they could not ignore. Alyssa Moore helped organize the galley in silence, while replacement crew boarded one by one. Unlike the previous team, every new crew member approached Naomi respectfully before taking position. Not exaggerated, not performative, just human. Naomi acknowledged each greeting politely, but without warmth. Respect that only appeared after revelation no longer impressed her. The businessman seated across from 1A finally stood and walked slowly toward her. He looked uncomfortable enough to leave entirely, but something stronger than embarrassment pushed him forward. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Naomi looked at him patiently. For what part? The question caught him off guard immediately. He hesitated. For assuming things. Naomi nodded once. "Most people do." He glanced around the cabin awkwardly. "I did not realize who you were." Naomi's expression remained calm. That is exactly the point. The words hit him harder than any accusation could have. He lowered his eyes briefly before returning to his seat without another sentence. Alyssa watched the exchange carefully. Naomi never humiliated people back. She simply forced them to confront themselves. That was somehow more powerful. The replacement captain entered moments later, a middle-aged Latina pilot named Captain Elena Ramirez with silver wings pinned neatly against her Navy uniform. She approached Naomi directly before stepping into the cockpit. "Miss Carter," she said professionally, "I reviewed the incident summary before boarding. I am deeply sorry." Naomi studied her for a brief second, then nodded. "Thank you, Captain." Elena hesitated before adding quietly, "No passenger should ever have to earn basic dignity after already paying for it." Naomi looked at her a little longer this time. Exactly. It was the first genuine moment of understanding anyone had offered all evening. The cabin slowly resumed movement around them. Overhead bins closed. Safety checks restarted. The storm outside weakened into steady rain while runway lights stretched across the wet pavement like blurred gold lines beneath the dark sky. But even as normal flight procedures resumed, nobody inside first class behaved normally anymore. A woman near row 3 leaned toward Naomi softly. "My daughter watched everything tonight." Naomi turned toward her. The woman glanced at the little girl beside her. "Thank you for staying calm the way you did." Naomi looked at the child for a moment before answering quietly. "I stayed calm because losing control would have changed the story instead of exposing it." The mother nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant. Alyssa felt chills hearing those words. She realized then how fragile fairness really was in spaces built around appearance and perception. Naomi had not merely exposed one cruel employee tonight. She exposed a culture that allowed assumptions to masquerade as professionalism until someone powerful enough forced people to see it clearly. A compliance officer approached Naomi again holding a digital review tablet. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "Corporate Media Relations is requesting guidance before the passenger videos spread online." Several passengers nearby exchanged looks. Immediately. Of course, people recorded everything. In modern America, moments like this rarely stayed private anymore. Naomi glanced toward the windows where rain continued slipping down the glass in long silver streaks. "No statements tonight," she replied calmly. "Let the footage speak honestly." The officer nodded and stepped away. Passengers absorbed that answer in silence. Naomi could have controlled the narrative instantly, protected the company image, buried the story behind legal language and public relations phrasing. Instead, she allowed truth to stand on its own. Alyssa suddenly understood why Naomi built an airline in the first place. It was never only about business. It was about ownership inside spaces where people once tried convincing her she did not belong. Captain Ramirez's voice finally echoed through the cabin speakers, warm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience this evening. We are now cleared for departure to New York." Soft applause broke out unexpectedly across first class. Not loud, not celebratory, just human acknowledgement after something difficult. Naomi returned quietly to seat 1A as the aircraft door finally closed. The same seat they tried removing her from. The same seat she never once surrendered. And as Flight 908 slowly pushed back from Gate C-17 into the rain-soaked night, every person on board understood they had not simply witnessed a confrontation. They had witnessed what happens when dignity refuses to move even when power demands it. Flight 908 climbed above the storm 38 minutes after leaving Atlanta, breaking through thick gray clouds into a sky washed silver by moonlight. The turbulence faded gradually until the cabin settled into the quiet rhythm of overnight travel. Soft reading lights glowed above sleeping passengers while Manhattan-bound business travelers reopened laptops and half-finished conversations. But even at 37,000 feet, nobody on board had fully escaped what happened before takeoff. The atmosphere remained thoughtful, humbled. Every person sitting in first class carried the memory differently, but nobody carried it lightly. Naomi Carter sat quietly in seat 1A. Beside the window, watching clouds drift beneath the wing like rolling white oceans under the midnight sky. Her hoodie sleeve rested slightly above her wrist now, revealing the silver watch Melissa had never bothered noticing earlier. Such a small detail, yet somehow symbolic of the entire night. People only saw what matched their expectations. Alyssa Moore walked slowly through the cabin, offering refreshments alongside the replacement crew. She moved differently now, more observant. more careful about the invisible assumptions people carry into spaces they believe belong to certain kinds of individuals. When she reached Naomi's row, she paused briefly. "Can I bring you anything, Miss Carter?" Naomi looked up from the window. "Tea would be nice." "Thank you." Alyssa nodded softly and disappeared toward the galley. No fear in the interaction anymore. No hierarchy either. Just respect given naturally instead of strategically. Across the aisle, the businessman who once mocked Naomi closed his laptop and stared quietly out toward the cabin lights stretching overhead. He had spent most of the flight replaying his own behavior in painful detail. The comment he made, the assumptions he carried, the ease with which he accepted humiliation happening to someone else because the target did not look powerful enough to defend herself. That realization unsettled him more than Naomi exposing the crew. He finally understood how ordinary people help systems survive simply by remaining comfortable while they happen. Near row 3, the mother traveling with her daughter tucked a blanket around the little girl who had fallen asleep shortly after takeoff. Before closing her own eyes, she looked once more toward Naomi sitting alone at the front of the cabin. She knew her daughter would remember tonight for years. Not because of conflict, because of composure. Because she watched a black woman stand inside public humiliation without surrendering dignity for even a second. Alyssa returned moments later carrying Naomi's tea carefully on a small service tray. "Chamomile," she said softly. "I thought you might want something calming after tonight." Naomi accepted the cup with a faint smile. "That is thoughtful." Alyssa hesitated before speaking again. "Can I ask you something?" Naomi nodded once. "When they were accusing you earlier, were you angry?" Naomi looked down into the steam rising from the tea before answering. "Of course." Alyssa seemed surprised by the honesty. Naomi continued quietly. "But anger was never the real danger in that moment." "What was?" Alyssa asked. Naomi glanced toward the sleeping passengers surrounding them, allowing them to convince me I needed their permission to belong there. Alyssa stood speechless for a second, because suddenly the entire night made sense in a deeper way than policy violations or executive authority. Naomi had not fought for status. She fought against erasure. The kind that happens silently when people decide who deserves comfort, luxury, patience, or respect based entirely on appearance. Alyssa nodded slowly. "I do not think I will ever forget tonight." Naomi looked at her gently. "Good. Then make sure you notice the next person before things escalate that far again." Alyssa swallowed hard and nodded once more before quietly returning to the galley. Naomi leaned back into seat 1A as the cabin lights dimmed further for the remainder of the flight to New York. Outside the window, the clouds stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft, glowing pale beneath moonlight. Peaceful, untouched by the storm below. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, exhaustion finally reaching her now that the confrontation had ended. But even in silence, the memory lingered. Not because she was surprised by what happened, because she was tired of how predictable it remained. People loved diversity in advertisements, inclusion in speeches, equality in mission statements. But true dignity became complicated the moment power wore a face they did not expect. A few hours later, Flight 908 would land at John F. Kennedy International Airport, and passengers would continue into their separate lives carrying different versions of the same story. Some would describe the drama, others the consequences. But the truth of the night was far simpler than headlines would ever capture. A black woman boarded a plane she owned. People looked at her and saw someone who did not belong. And when the truth finally forced itself into the room, the most powerful thing she ever did was remain seated.